I'm Kate Quinn, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Kate Quinn.
I'd like to thank some sponsors who, due to their generous support of the show, help bring this to you each and every time we bring you the show. From Eamon Ambrose, author of the best-selling sci-fi serial 0 Hour, comes a new novelette, Love and Other Algorithms. When Frank, a personal robot assistant, meets a similar model named Shelley, they are inexplicably linked and form an instant bond. But when outside forces conspire to separate them, Frank must decide how far he will go to save their relationship. However, all is not as it seems, and as Frank searches for Shelley, he learns that they are both part of something much, much bigger. Out now from Amazon, Love and Other Algorithms by Eamon Ambrose. Hey authors, are you looking for a beautiful professional cover for your science fiction or fantasy book? Holly Heisey Designs offers custom illustration and cover design with characters that will put your people center stage, spaceships designed from the ground up and scenery that makes your world come alive. Visit Holly Heisey Design to book a custom cover or view pre-made ebook covers ready to purchase. Holly is an award-winning illustrator and designer who's done work for the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, the Future Chronicles anthology series, and USA Today and Amazon.com best-selling authors. Holly will bring your story world to life and get you a cover that will help sell your book. Visit hollyheiseydesign.com for more information on how to book your custom cover design or purchase pre-mades, as well as join the Holly Heisey Design Facebook group for discounts and first dibs at all the new spaceship and fantasy pre-made covers. Find all of this at hollyheiseydesign.com. A Bright Shore, The Eden Chronicles, Book 1 by S.M. Anderson, a military sci-fi political thriller set just a short decade from now in 2031, holding to the concept of individual liberty can get you killed. Western civilization is in collapse, a process led and driven by the world's leading supposed democracies, our own included. What was once the Western world's guiding light of liberty is quickly being replaced by state-sponsored serfdom under the guise of a global economic reset done in the name of the workers. This is an exciting new novel by an exciting new talent, a debut novel, the first in a series from a former CIA operations officer who has decided that his lifelong writing habit, hobby, obsession is more fun than real work. Go pick up a copy today of A Bright Shore, The Eden Chronicles, Book 1 by S.M. Anderson. There's a link to all of our great sponsors in the show notes at hankgarner.com. Stick around at the end of our excellent interview today for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. As always, thanks for listening. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Kate Quinn on the show with me. Kate has a new book called The Alice Network, and this book is phenomenal. I can't wait for all of you to pick it up, read it. It's generated a lot of buzz in the few months that it's been out, and I think you guys are really going to love it. Welcome to the show, Kate.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm excited to have you. But before we get started with our interview, we begin with the same question on each show. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I think it probably came with the fact that I had a Kings and Queens of England paper doll book when I was 6 or 7 years old. And I loved that thing, and I loved to color it in, and I read those little simplified biographies, and I thought I could write a story about this. And I ended up writing my very first story, age 7, front and back of a sheet of typing paper, and it was all about the assassination of Edward II, so there you have it.
Nice. And how old were you?
I was 7 years old, and I had absolutely no idea that the real story of the assassination of Edward II is quite a bit more violent and bloody and not G-rated. for a young audience.
Well, that's hilarious because, we're going to get into all of your books in just a little bit, but, you write historical fiction, mostly. And was that a thread? I mean, that seems like it was a thread from when you were 7 years old and you're kind of creating your own, stories within the historical facts. Were you a bookish kid when you were young?
You really don't get much more bookish. I was lucky enough to have a librarian for a mother.
Oh, goodness.
And not only that, but she had her degree in ancient and medieval history. So when I was a kid, before I could even learn to read, I was getting stories about, Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon and the, Alexander and the Gordian Knot, instead of getting stories about, Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty. I was watching Claudius instead of the Disney Channel. So it was natural for me to gravitate toward the past as soon as I started to have the urge to write. And I never really left it.
I love it. I love it. Did you know that you wanted to pursue writing? A lot of us, know that we want to be writers, and there's a storytelling gene that switches on at some point, or that we notice is switched on. But there's not always the time that you want to actually write, and publish, doesn't necessarily coincide with you knowing that you are a storyteller. When did you know that you wanted to be a writer and that you wanted to write novels?
Well, again, it was sort of, I could hardly remember a time when I didn't. I did my first book when I was 10, and that was a few years after that Edward II story. And it was a terrible book, and I was completely happy with the process of writing it, though. And I pretty much always had a book that I was trying to work on ever since. And it gave me pleasure. I didn't know what else to do. As far as a hobby went, it was intensely satisfying. And, at some point, of course, I started to dream of publication, probably when I was around the high school time. And even though I sent out a whole lot of, letters for agents and, letters to publishers, and I got my requisite stack of rejections, I always knew that I would continue to write stories whether or not they were published, and that certainly is the case. I mean, if I had never been published, I would just continue to be writing books and putting them under the bed. It's not that I don't know how to do anything else.
The fantasy author Brandon Sanderson was on the show a year or so ago, and he said the same thing. He said, I would be writing novels if they were never published. And as a matter of fact, I think he wrote 13 novels before his first was published. And he said, if I never would have gotten published, then when I died, my kids would have just inherited, boxes and boxes and boxes of books that I wrote, because it's just a thing that you have to do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's the exact same thing with me. And I think I may even have him beat as far as trunk novels go. I think I've got 13 or 14 maybe.
Nice.
And although the idea that anybody after I die might find them is terrifying. I think I should probably burn them just so that, posterity never ever knows.
Exactly.
Terrible, because they're really bad.
Well, growing up with a librarian, a lot of guests that I've had talk about this feeling that of loving books, but not really understanding that books come from people. A lot of people talk about, I would go in and get books off the shelf, but it never occurred to me that these things were created by actual people, and people like me. And, if I really work at my craft, I could write a book like that. Was it ever mysterious like that for you, or growing up with a librarian, was it just always accessible to you?
Books were just a part of the household, and they were so very much a part of what I did because, even at a young age, I didn't think I'd learned to read particularly young, as the way a lot of authors do, but a lot of writers do, and book lovers. But my parents all read to me, and my mother and my father both, and they read me stories from when I was too young to read. And so story was a huge part of every single day, storytelling. And so as soon as I was reading myself, I was devouring the books even more. But I think it was just such a part of the house, it didn't occur to me that these worlds weren't real. They certainly seemed much more real to me than anything that was in the real world at times. And that, of course, is the magic of any really good book.
Yeah. Did you pursue writing as a career, or did you study and work in other fields while you worked on your writing?
I actually went to school for music because, my mother was a librarian, my father was a jazz musician. My skill did not lie in jazz. I was a classical singer, and I worked and studied opera at Boston University. And so while I was studying music and, singing in practice rooms, I was also writing books on the side. So sort of both of these passions, music and books, kept going on parallel tracks. And at some point, it was actually around the time I graduated from Boston University with my master's degree in vocal performance, that right around that period, maybe a year or so later, I got my first agent. And around that point, that was when I decided, all right, I'll see if she can sell something. And then she ended up selling a book that I'd had under the bed for a little while, but wasn't quite as terrible as the ones that came before it. And after quite a bit of polishing, she sold the book that I'd written my freshman year of school as a freshman music student.
Wow. Do the disciplines of music and writing overlap for you?
Actually,
or is there any correlation?
Styles. And they're both arts, but one's a performance art and one is a more introverted art. And I've always loved to sing, and I will certainly never stop that. But it does result in very different lifestyles. And as more I got into both singing and the writing, I realized that, as a writer, I have a lifestyle that suits me absolutely the best. I think I'm extremely lucky to be able to do it. So writing won out over the music as far as a career went, but I still have music as very much a part of my day. I write to music every single day. So
I was just about to ask you that. Does listening to music kickstart your creativity for writing?
Oh, absolutely. I tend to have certain soundtracks that I like, for whatever reason. They'll pull something that is, feels like a thread that's relevant in the current book that I'm working on. And quite a lot of great film soundtracks out there. They can be wonderful writing music. And, I'll turn on an opera as well, if I really feel like something that is getting a story going. Gotcha.
So tell me about that first book that was published and that landed you your agent.
That was a book which eventually ended up being titled Mistress of Rome. It was the first of 4 novels that I wrote set in first century Roman Empire. Ancient Rome probably being just about my first love, historically speaking. And that one ended up getting picked up about 6 or 7 years, maybe after I had originally wrote it and had done countless changes on it. But my agent picked that one up kind of out of a slush pile, and I was very, very grateful that she did so and that she was able to give me the criticism that I needed to get it into any kind of, shape where it deserved to be read or even looked at.
What was the, well, first off, what was the story of that book? And why do you love Ancient Rome? Why is that your first love?
Well, I think Ancient Rome is a wonderful period because there's really such a pageantry about it where you have these tremendous differences in the way it looks and the way it is. Because on the one hand, you see these tremendous advancements in architecture and art and in government. You have, a republic that gives way to an empire. You have these codified laws and all of these wonderfully advanced things in a society that really did some absolutely incredible things. And I always say I'd like to go back to Ancient Rome in one part because, they had, wonderful public bathing systems. And that's very important if you're going to time travel. But on the other hand, you still had the institution empire-wide of slavery, and you still had the mass wars that were going on, and you still had animals and people being killed by the thousands in the Colosseum, for public amusement. So the tremendous range there is something I find fascinating and colorful. It has all kinds of interesting grist as far as interest figures. You just have to be made into fictional adventure. So that's one reason. So my first book was a little bit of a spread across the Roman Empire as far as what my own interests in that dichotomy were. I have a Jewish slave girl who is has a particularly nasty mistress she is trying to endure under. And I have a star gladiator who is making his way up the ranks in the Colosseum. And I have a very upright senator and a streetwise little kid who has a talent for pissing off people in power. And all of these people come together in a variety of ways under the reign of a particularly enigmatic and sometimes nasty-tempered emperor who was Emperor Domitian. And they will all have a hand in his eventual fate, which was really quite spectacular.
Kate, what do you think it is about these historical stories that we like to revisit over and over again from a reader's perspective? What do you think it is that enchants us so much with these stories?
Well, I think the most parts of history that, that do tend to generate a lot of fiction, often they're golden age periods, like the period of the Tudors, which really saw such a blossoming in English history. We tend to like to go back to that. Ancient Rome, again, was a period with so much advancement and blooming, as well as all the bloodshed that provides, fascination and gore, because people do get fascinated by gore. But I think ultimately the power of historical fiction is that it doesn't matter, in a sense, that you can Google and find out what happens, because it's all about the how of something happened, how something happened, and not just that it did. So you can read 3 different authors' take on the same event, whether that event is, the career of Alexander the Great, or whether it's, Elizabeth I taking the throne, or whether it's far more, it's something, it's, going over the top of the trenches in World War I. These are events that grab the imagination, and that 3 different writers can write 3 completely different versions of the same kind of historical event, or 3,000 writers. And sometimes it seems like there are that many books out there about, certain very popular periods of history, but I think we still keep coming back to it because in the end, as readers, we want to time travel.
Yeah. As a writer, your newest book, The Alice Network, is set in World War I. And that, even though that's, at this point, more than a century away from us, but it feels more, obviously it feels more current, but we're closer to it than your Rome stories. Were there any differences in writing the Rome series as opposed to the newest one that's closer to now? And did you approach the writing of those 2 differently?
Yeah, there were a lot of changes, and some of those were, fascinating and very, very cool, and some were a little bit on the frustrating side, and sometimes they were both, flip sides of the same thing. When I write about ancient Rome, there's often much less historical material to work with. I could have entire years or decades of even a very powerful man's life, an emperor's life, about which very, very little would be known. And that was par for the course because, this is over 1,000 years ago, and this information has a way of disappearing or becoming lost. So as a novelist, you have to fill in those gaps, often with your own imagination, with your own research, with the best guess that you've got. And that can be frustrating when you have very little to go on, but on the other hand, it gives you a lot of room to play. When you have events that are only 100 years ago, you are looking at a lot more of a complete historical record. Now, you're not going to get the whole historical record, because I don't think anything ever has every single thing about it survive, no matter what historical instant that is. So there's always going to be gaps, but there are many fewer gaps, and you have to be a lot more careful to get your facts right, because there are a lot more facts that are out there to get wrong and trip over. So that's both a blessing and a curse. You have to have a lot more material to wade through, but on the other hand, when you have a lot more material, you never know when the next piece of information is going to suddenly inspire you to go down an entirely new plot hole.
Right. And that was going to be my question. Since there would be so many more gaps in the historical record of in the Rome series that you were working on, was that easier or harder to write, or was it more freeing to not have to be beholden to the strict facts?
I honestly couldn't say. I mean, I just think it's different. When I put a hat on for historical that it's set in the ancient world, I already know that, all right, this is a period that I know I'm going to have to be, reliant a little bit more on my imagination to fill in gaps. And when I'm putting a hat on for a 20th century novel, it's just simply a different process where I know I need to fill those gaps a lot more thoroughly. And I know the information is much more likely to be there if I need to find it. So I just think of it as being a different process rather than one being better than the other. The only thing that is always, for every book which is in a new period is how much research you need to do to get that familiarity with the period that you feel you can tell a story there. At least after 4 books in ancient Rome, I kind of in the same century of ancient Rome, around the same succession of emperors, I know that period really well. It's right at my fingertips, and I don't need to do a lot of daily life kind of research in order to find my world and build it. Whereas coming to the 20th century wasn't just a matter of having a lot more information. It was the fact that this was a period that was completely new to me. So all of a sudden, after, writing 4 books where I didn't even have to look up a dinner menu or, how much a loaf of bread cost or these little things like that are details you need, because I had those details at my fingertips already. All of a sudden, it was like being thrown into the deep end of a pool and I didn't know anything. So there's a lot of reading that needs to be done before you can even get to that feel of familiarity that you want.
Right. There were 4 books in the Empress of Rome series. Are you finished with Rome? Have you said everything you wanted to say about that time period?
I might go back to Rome because I love it. I probably would do something different from the Rome series, which I think of as complete. And I would maybe go to a different, spot in Rome's history and try to find something new and interesting to say. So I would not rule that out at all. But for the time being, I've really been fascinated by the 20th century war fiction world, which is what I got into sort of jumping in with both feet, with the Alice Network. And I'm enjoying that very much. So I'd like to stay there for now.
So how did that happen, Kate? You are firmly rooted in Rome. You've got 4 books. Like you said, the facts, the culture, everything is right at your fingertips. You easily probably could have written another 4 books there, and have been comfortable. What brought you to the 20th century?
Well, I've never been a one era writer. I've always had way more ideas than I will ever have time to write. And those ideas have always spanned any number of historical eras that interest me. And so I was looking around, for the next book, and I was kind of thinking I'd like to do something different, because after a while you can sort of oversaturate on, one historical period. I did hit a point, I think, with the Rome books where I did sort of feel like I was going to stab myself in the eyeball if I had to type the word TOGA one more time. But I was looking around and saying, what's selling? What is the trend, right? What are trends in books that people are really enjoying? And I was seeing a real boom in the 20th century war fiction. And I think part of that may have been because, we had the 100-year anniversary for World War I, and a lot of interest popped up because of that. So I started reading pretty much anything I could get my hands on, just to see what I could find, see if there would be something that would give me that spark that would make me want to think, oh yes, this could be a book. I could do this. And I was lucky enough to come across a lovely little nonfiction book called Women Heroes of World War I, in which I found a lovely essay about Louise de Bettigny, who was the genius behind and the leader of the historic Alice Network. And I had never heard of this woman. I had never heard of her network or the women she worked with and who worked for her. So I read that and it fascinated me, and I thought this could easily be a wonderful novel. And in fact, almost any of the female heroes in that lovely book actually could have been heroines of their own novels, but it ended up being Louise and the Alice Network that really grabbed me.
To just dip back for just a second, what you said a few minutes ago about having more ideas and not wanting to be a single era writer, it always baffles me when people say, ask, where do you get your ideas from? Or to hear a writer say, well, I don't know if I have another idea. Usually writers are inundated with ideas. The problem is, how do I have time to get to all the things that I want to get to? And when you come across those little facts and, little nuggets of history that just come alive in your mind, like that sparked the Alice Network, that's a phenomenal feeling.
Oh, it's the best on earth. There's nothing like it. And as you say, it's like my only regret is that I'm not able to write a book a week, because I swear if I did, I would still have ideas that I couldn't get to.
Right. I also find it very interesting that you researched the market a little bit before digging into this book, because there's a prevailing idea with some writers that you should never write to market, and who cares what the market says? If you're going to write serious literature, just write it, and the market will come to you or they won't, but the idea that you want to write a book that people are interested in and actually want to read, does not preclude it from being a great book that has something to say and that can actually really touch people.
Well, my own thought is always, I do agree that writers should write what they love, and I don't think there's any writer out there who can write something that they don't love. But there's no harm in trying to see if, looking at, analyzing market trends, looking at the things that people are reading, what are the things that are grabbing the national imagination. These are valuable questions to look at, and there's, I think, certainly no harm in finding, that Venn diagram sweet spot between what are the things that, you see the reading public reading, and then is there also an overlap with the kind of things that you love to write and research about? So I've always tried to, find that sweet spot. It is true that it's tough to write to a trend because, if it takes a year to write a book and another year to put it out, well, who knows what the trend is by the time the book is out. So there's value in that, chasing trends too much might be a little bit like chasing goldfish around in a bowl. But I also think it's valuable to look around at what are the things that are fascinating readers, because that too is something that, you want to make sure that, your readers are going to be interested by the next thing you're putting out.
Right, exactly. So in the Alice Network, we've got two women that we are mainly following along with the book. We've got Charlie and Eve. Tell us about these two women, and how did these two women come into your life?
Well, these are my two heroines who I wanted to throw together as being, when you first see them, a bit of opposites. We have Charlie, who is a 19-year-old girl in 1947, and she's in a pickle. She's pregnant, she's unmarried, she's got a very unhappy family, and they are trying to shuffle her off to Europe to get this little problem taken care of before anyone will find out the worst about her. And she, however, also has something else in mind. She wants to find out what happened to a cousin of hers, who's a French cousin who disappeared in World War II, who she loved like a sister. And so she's taking this opportunity when she hits Europe to pursue that goal. And that goal leads her first and foremost to a woman whose response to her is to wave a pistol in her face and tell her to get off her doorstep. And that woman is Eve. And I had a lot of fun with Eve. She, when you go back in time and see the World War I storyline, in which she is a young woman and making her way through her own war, she is a spy back from that era, and a very good one. And you see the woman she has become post-World War II, a woman with a drinking problem and a Luger that she waves in people's faces if they annoy her. And then I put these women in a car together and sent them in a road trip across France with a Scotsman at the wheel, and I decided to see what would happen. And it turned out to be quite a roller coaster for me as well as for, hopefully, the readers.
Do you plot before you write the book? When you start learning the characters and get an idea for the maybe the historical fact that the book is based around, how much work goes into the pre-writing?
I did a lot for this book because it was the first time I'd ever written a dual timeline, and so I had quite a lot of intricate planning to do to make sure that those two timelines would mesh together in the way that I wanted them to. So I ended up planning each timeline out A to Z all on its own, although I didn't get all the way to Z. It's more like I knew what I was doing through about the first half of the alphabet, and then the second half is a little more amorphous, and I kind of generally knew where it was going to end up by the time it hit Z. But I planned each one out separately just before I started writing, and then when I began writing, I wrote the way the book is now, which alternates back and forth chapter by chapter from World War I to the post-World War II timeline. So that actually did more plotting than I have done for other books, but I didn't regret it for this one because it was a complicated thing to put together.
Well, and you can tell, it reads like your plotting is intricate, and it is exceptional in that you get to the end of one of those chapters and you're like, oh my God, I can't wait to get to that next one to find out what's going to happen. But I've got to take I've got to time travel. I'll take a detour here. But I know that Kate's not going to let me down. She's going to bring it together. And, it's crazy. But it was a lot of fun, You could tell, that the plotting was, that it didn't just come together.
Yeah, it was quite a bit of work to do, but it was also kind of fun. It was like doing a jigsaw puzzle, and it was kind of a pleasure in seeing finally the pieces come together the way I wanted them to, even though that did require a great deal of editing and a certain amount of reconfiguration in some places, because the characters usually will end up leading you down slightly different paths than you've anticipated, and that requires a certain amount of rearranging of the jigsaw puzzle.
Well, that's what editing is for. You get to the end of the story and you say, well, I could do this better. And then you have the whole thing to look at. And then like you said, you get to be puzzle master and work it out. And, I think a lot of people get too stressed out about the planning, and maybe they don't have the whole thing planned out from the beginning, but that's what editing is for. That's, you get to work out those kinks later.
Yeah. And I enjoy both parts of the process, drafting and editing, but editing is definitely where the magic happens. And I do think that there's no way anybody should ever publish, or even try to, publish a first draft, because editing is where all the cleaning up has to occur, and all the quite often when you see things that you didn't even realize you were doing during the drafting process, and you highlight some and then you take some out and think, what was I thinking there? And so the editing process really is essential.
Yeah. So the Alice Network was a real thing. What was first? How did you find out about this little historical nugget? These women, and what did they do?
Well, the Alice Network was a real-life network of spies, many of them women, who worked in occupied France against the German overlords, as it were. And they were accounted one of the most successful spy networks of the war, if not the most successful. They were organized by a woman named Louise de Bettigny, who was a French genteel aristocrat who had been on bad times a little bit and was reporting herself as a governess before the war. She was multilingual and very, very smart. And when she was recruited by British intelligence at the start of the war, she went into occupied France and recruited almost up to, I think, somewhere between 80 and 100 agents who would take information and pass it on to her, and then which she would collate into a report and pass to British intelligence. And she was good at this, and her sources were so reliable that the men in British intelligence were absolutely gabbling over her effectiveness and her heroism, like teenage girls at a One Direction concert. They really could not say enough good things. And I won't tell you how that network finally came to an end, don't want to spoil anything, but really the women who worked in it were astoundingly brave and excuse me. And I really couldn't believe that I had not heard about them at school. I had never come across them until I found this nonfiction book called Women Heroes of World War I.
Wow. Did you find any stories of any of the actual women that were involved in the Alice Network?
Yes, I actually used quite a few of the tales from the real sources. But yeah, I was actually able to read quite a lot of letters from the real sources of the Alice Network, and those actually had some absolutely wonderful, anecdotes that I tried to weave in as much as possible so I could use their actual voices, and so I could, use some of the real things that had happened to them and the real sources that they had. And then some of my characters who are fictional, like Eve, were actually based on very small snippets about people who we know were there, but we don't necessarily know more than that. We knew that, for example, when a certain arrest happened by one of the women in the network, she was arrested with a local girl whose name was Marguerite. Well, the Germans thought, well, that girl obviously had nothing to do with it. She was just a terrified local girl who didn't know what she was getting into. And they let her go. And that's all that history has to say about her. But in my mind, I asked, well, maybe she wasn't just a local girl. Maybe she was a spy too. And her getting away was just the act of a lifetime. So that ended up being a scene in the book where it had a tiny bit of historical truth in there, just a little nugget, and then I took the nugget and tried to build something out of that, which didn't make it into the historical record because the Germans didn't know any better.
Right. What sort of you talked about? Well, let me ask you this. One thing that I love about this book is that you really take us on an emotional roller coaster. There's some very intense scenes in this book. There are some very heartwarming scenes in this book. There are some lots of action, but it's also very funny in places. Is that a conscious effort on your part to make sure that you take the reader through the gamut of emotions? When things get too intense over here, let me lighten it up a little bit here. Or is this just how the characters begin to act for you?
I think it's probably a bit more personal style for me. I love humor in historical fiction, and I think it can be sometimes a little bit of a fault of the genre that it can take itself very seriously sometimes, you know.
Right.
Sometimes there's a bit too much of an effort to instruct. And I think, if we're writing fiction, the effort should first of all to be to entertain before we instruct, because nonfiction is for instructing. So I've always tried to incorporate humor in my books. It's something I love reading, so I always try to pull that through as a thread. And as far as, just the other emotions being utilized, is that I've never seen why action belongs only in action, novels, or why romance belongs only in romance novels, or why, emotional drama only belongs, say, in literary novels. I mean, these are the spectrum of human emotions that we feel as human beings. So I've always loved best to try to incorporate all of these things. I love a good action scene where people are racing to, disarm a bad guy. And I love a good love scene if you have two people your reader's been aching to see get together, and they finally do. And I love a good emotional showdown where some high moment of feeling is finally being aired, whether it's passion or whether it's rage or whether it's friendship or anything else. So it's always something I've tried to incorporate in anything and I'm very glad you think I succeeded here.
Yeah, absolutely. When you published the book, did you have any idea that it was going to resonate so deeply with audiences the way it has? I know it was picked up and promoted by several very prominent book clubs. I think Reese Witherspoon featured it. That had to be, a pretty intense feeling. It was one of NPR's best books of 2017. All these people were really connecting with the book. How did that make you feel as a writer?
Oh, it was quite a roller coaster. And, I don't know even what to say about it, because this is always how you hope, that a book will be received,
Right.
that it will resonate with many readers. Never know how or if that's exactly going to happen, because the world is a strange place, and you can never guarantee that somebody like Reese will pick up a book and decide to read it and decide she likes it. So it's the kind of thing it's hard to, possible to plan for, and all I could do was sort of hang on and enjoy the ride, and it's been wonderful.
What do you hope people take from this book, Kate? When they pick up the book, or what's the first thing that you want them to come away from the book with? And then after that, is there something deeper that you want them to take away?
I think the overall thing I'm hoping they will take away from it is that women are capable of doing amazing and extraordinary things, wonderfully brave things, wonderfully patriotic things, and wonderfully intelligent and fantastic and outrageous things. And they always have been able to do this throughout history and all the way up into the now. So I hope we will remember the women of the past, like the women of the Alice Network, who did such astounding feats. And I hope that will inspire women now to go on and do some astounding feats of their own.
And maybe through books like this, we will get to a point one day where people don't have to point out that women can do amazing things and patriotic things. And I hate that we're still, fighting that battle. But with books like this, I hope that becomes a thing of the past.
Well, I do too. And it's something that I really think of as what I want to do with my storytelling going forward, is to find these women in history who have maybe been forgotten or just not remembered as well as they could be. And I don't just want to write these stories. I also want to read them, and I want to see them on screens too. I was so thrilled to see, that there's, for example, right around the time this book was released, the movie Hidden Figures came out. The African-American code programmers who worked in the NASA space race in the 50s and 60s. What a wonderful story that was. And that came from a book as well. And that was such a thrilling thing to watch and to read, to see some bit of history that I didn't know about, and to read about women who had done things that I had never had any idea. And I really hope that we continue to see more of it.
I agree. Kate, I know you have a new book that you've been working on, but we don't have any details we can share about it. But will you tell us, is it historical fiction? And if so, can you tell us when about it's set?
Yes, it is historical fiction, and I definitely can tell you a little bit, even though if I don't have a title yet, because right now it's just Untitled book. I'm terrible at titles. But it involves a post-World War II hunt for Nazi war criminals who have fled to Earth in America. And twined with that is another storyline about the Night Witches, which was the nickname that was given to an all-female regiment of night bomber pilots who flew against Hitler's Eastern Front in World War II from Russia. And these Russian ladies were some of the most badass I've ever had the privilege of writing about, and I cannot wait to share their story, which is going to come out in February next year.
I can't wait. Cannot wait. Kate, when it does, will you come back on the show and talk to us about it?
I would absolutely love to.
I would love that. Kate, if people are just learning about you and getting to know you, where can they connect with you online to follow along and look for news?
Well, you can find me on Facebook. Just look for Kate Quinn Author. I'm there also on Twitter and on Instagram. And I have a website, which is just katequinnauthor.com if you want to find my social media buttons there. But I generally can be found avoiding my word count on Facebook or Instagram or posting pictures of my dogs. So I encourage you to look me up.
Excellent. Kate, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Natalie, it's Artie. Listen, I'm going to be late for dinner. I ran out of gas on... He climbed out of the car and peered at the sign. On Sleepy Hollow Road. There's nothing but trees, and I have to find a gas station. Save me a drumstick. He hung up his cell and stuck it in his pocket, zipping his jacket. He was going to have to walk and pray somebody picked him up. A sliver of crescent moon hung above, surrounded by clouds, like a grinning drunk asleep in a puddle. Artie walked, using his tablet as a flashlight, eyes on the gravel ahead. He crossed over a dark ravine. The trunks and overhanging branches were matted thick with wild grapevines and threw a cavernous gloom over the road. A figure stood at a crossroads ahead. It looked pale and wan and blue. A woman? He had an impression of fragility and age, and thought of his warty old landlady. But his landlady would not be standing at a crossroads in the dark. "Excuse me?" Artie said, surprised by the fear in his own voice. "Do you know where I can find a gas station? I'm empty." "Then let me fill you," the figure whispered. It rushed at him. It entered him. He dropped the tablet, fell to his knees, and lost his body to another driver. When Artie woke again, he was dangling in midair. The woods were pitch black. The only lights were fireflies. Fireflies everywhere, like dancing stars. He struggled and cried out, his yellow sneakers trying to find the ground. "Shh," said a voice. "It will all be over soon." Panic rose. He felt invisible hands on his legs, on his arms, invisible fingers around his neck, reaching up the back of his shirt. He heard the sound of water running below, high and agitated, as if through a stony brook. The crescent moon swung out of the sky, falling into the water. Blood rushed into his cheeks. He realized he had been flipped upside down. He yelled and groped, flecking his own face with spit, helpless to drive away whatever was attacking him. He felt a sharp pain between his shoulder blades, and air flew out of his lungs. A spray of blood hit his cheeks, hot and clinging. His hands found a sharp branch protruding from his body. It had speared him through his back and out through his chest. He tried to say help, but had no air to form the word. Blood poured up his body. No, it poured down. It only felt as if it were rising, climbing his neck, covering his face, gathering in his scalp. He reached for the ribbon of blood that fell from his crown into the trickle of moonlight below. The ribbon slipped through his fingers. It thinned, choked, became a tiny rivulet. His tanks were empty. Not even fumes. His engine began to sputter. The flow became a drip, a maddening drip like the drip, drip, drip of his kitchen faucet. The drip his landlady hadn't fixed. The drip that kept him up at night. This drip would not be keeping him up. He would sleep very well this night. Very well indeed. The fireflies slipped into shadow. A figure appeared, blue as gaslight, bony and toothless. A crone from a fairy tale.
"Thank you, my friends," she whispered. "I am thankful for this good harvest."
She neared, scrutinized him with manic intensity, and turned away, muttering to herself in a sing-song rhythm as she, too, vanished into the trees.
"A man may toil from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done."